This one's all about burros. My name is Corey Golden. I'm the Advocacy and Communications Coordinator for RTF. Thank you all for supporting wild horses and burros and for supporting Return to Freedom. Your support makes it possible not only to care for more than 500 horses and 40 burros at our sanctuary and to act as a voice for horses and burros on the range, but to provide educational opportunities like this one. A few very quick housekeeping items. During the webinar, all participants will be muted except for the speaker. At the end of the presentation, we'll be using the remaining time for questions. For those of you who have logged into the free conference call website, you may type a question at any time by clicking the speech bubble in the meeting dashboard. That'll be the gray bar that's on your screen. For those of you who have called in, I'll have instructions on how to ask a question before we begin the Q&A. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Amy McLean. Dr. McLean has had a lifelong passion for equids with long ears. She grew up on a donkey and mule farm in Georgia. She has devoted her professional career to conducting donkey and mule research that focuses on improved management and well-being of these animals. McLean earned her PhD from Michigan State University in the area of equine science, where she studied methods to improve working donkey welfare in Mali, West Africa. She has conducted research with donkeys, mules, and hinnies in many countries with the continued focus of improving welfare of working equids, with the idea that improving their welfare will only help improve the welfare of the families that they work for. Amy is an equine lecturer for the University of California Davis Animal Science Program in Davis, California. Amy?
Okay, thank you, Corey, for the invitation to be here today. It's really an honor. If there's any background noise from a dog, that is a Jack Russell, and I apologize. He's excited about the webinar as well. So we'll just go ahead and get started. As you said, my background is more with donkeys and mules, and the longer I'm here in California, the more I learn about the free-roaming burro population. And towards the end of today's talk, I will actually talk a little bit about what we're doing at UC Davis to try to adopt some of these donkeys out and find homes for them. All right, so just a quick outline today. So I'll try to go over some of the differences in terminology that goes along with donkeys, burros, and we'll talk about burro versus donkey, tomato versus tomato, and really what is the difference in that terminology, as well as a global look at population, a look at free-roaming donkeys or burros here in the U.S., where donkeys originally came from, and I'm going to also touch on breeds of donkeys because I think that's important when we look at the heritage of the free-roaming burros here in the U.S. Also really important to talk a little bit about donkey behavior because they're definitely not horses with big ears, and some of the challenges for donkeys, burros, and wild asses that they're facing today. So many of y'all, if you're donkey or a burro enthusiast, you probably already know that donkeys were the first equine that were actually domesticated about 4,000 to 3,000 BC. However, they were first hunted for food. And after they were domesticated, the donkey played a really important role in connecting communities and civilizations because people were then able to be more nomadic and pack up all of their goods and go from place to place. And the spread of the human population, because of the area where these animals were first domesticated, was in that Mesopotamia region in Egypt, and that allowed people to expand up through Asia and then on over to Europe. So it's amazing the role that donkeys or burros have played throughout their life since being domesticated in terms of human civilization and human culture. When we look at a total worldwide population, there's about 55 million horses. We consider about 44 million donkeys. However, there's something that's happening that's actually causing the number of donkeys to decrease. And I will touch on this briefly, and it's a little bit disturbing, but a lot of donkeys are now being used for meat and skin products for Chinese traditional medicine, and it's starting to deplete the donkey population. There's also been a loss of habitat that has affected the number of donkeys worldwide, and then in some of the areas where wild asses are still located are actually war-stricken areas, and again, the number of those animals is decreasing. So again, just from a global look, we find most of our donkeys and mules, which are products of donkeys and horses, in developing countries. And that's the same for a lot of the wild asses that are still left out there. And I will talk a little bit about those different types of wild asses. But again, there's just as many mules and donkeys as there are horses, yet most of the time the interest is focused on the horses, or that 10% that's used in a recreational purpose. So kind of interesting in terms of research and how much resources are usually not devoted to our long ears. Another kind of fun fact, when we look at the number of burros that are here in the U.S., still in a free-roaming state, as you can see, most of those animals are still left in Arizona or Nevada, and there's quite a few of them out there, 13,000. Again, that's a lot less than the number of horses, but it's still a considerable population that, faces different challenges that we need to consider. So traditionally, donkeys, like I said, were originally hunted for food, and they're still being used for some types of human consumption from milk production in Eastern Europe, as well as some that are used for meat consumption. The donkey's milk is the closest thing to human's milk, and it's used for infants that are transitioning from their mom's milk to a formula. The interesting thing is the rise in dairy production for donkeys has actually increased the need and the population of donkeys in Eastern Europe, where that was also declining at one point. And it's actually preserved various breeds of donkeys that were close to being endangered or going extinct. The emerging issue, and I apologize, this slide is quite graphic, and this goes back to the increase in Chinese traditional medicine, and that's using the skin of the donkey for a project called Yizhao. And they take the donkey skins and they boil them down into a gelatin product. And this is greatly affecting the donkey population. And wild free-roaming donkeys are definitely a target, because it's quite easy for those populations to go under the radar and go to places like Mexico and not be accounted for and enter this market. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can go to the link that I've provided on this slide, and it will tell you more about the skin trade. So that's all I'm going to say about that for right now. Other uses of donkeys still focused on their traditional use as work animals, are still riding animals, pack animals, very important lifeline to many very small shareholder farmers in developing countries. And then also there's been a rise for donkeys in terms of showing and competition and as companion animals. And to me, this is an area that I see a lot of promise in future for our donkeys here in the U.S., from being an adopted donkey to a donkey that might be bred specifically for this sport. But before we go any further, I keep referring to the term donkey, and the title of the presentation is about burros. So what's really the difference in a donkey versus a burro? Burro is simply the Spanish word for donkey, and it's been a term that was coined by the government in terms of protection of donkeys that are on the range, but they're essentially the same animal. And again, it goes back to that analogy of tomato or tomato. If you look up on Wikipedia and you do some Google searches, you will find that there's various, quote, breeds or types of burros, such as the burro mexicano or the burro americana. Again, just a term to describe a donkey. Now, a donkey is a different species compared to horses. They belong to the Equus asinus, where a horse is Equus caballos. So I think that is important to recognize that. And I like to use the term donkey versus burro because I believe it gives the animal more value, and they don't see it as this unwanted animal or an animal that doesn't per se have an owner. So I'll continue to refer to our long-eared friends in this presentation as donkeys versus burros. A few other terms: female donkey can be a jenny, a jennet, and in Europe you'll often hear them referred to as mares, just like in horses. Male donkeys, not castrated, is a jack. Or in Europe, again, they will refer to them as a stallion. And then probably one of the best forms of a donkey is a gelding, or occasionally back east you'll hear people refer to them as a cut jack. And they make excellent pets, excellent companion animals. So just some fun science to add to the presentation. You'll see that there's a difference in the number of chromosomes compared to donkeys and horses. So this would be the same for a burro, because remember, it's just the Spanish word for donkey. They have 31 pairs of chromosomes, where a horse has 32 pairs. And the interesting thing about the number of chromosomes is when you cross the two species to make a hybrid, like the mule, all of the different chromosomes at that point do not communicate and share information. Some other unique things about donkeys in terms of their anatomy, and not just from their physical appearance, but there's other differences when you actually look at, just the fact there's not ergots on the hind legs, meaning likely during evolution they did not have a fifth toe in the hind foot. So maybe they originally came from a more desert-like climate than the marsh that we think of small horses originally coming from. One thing that's always somewhat difficult for practicing veterinarians who have not treated a lot of donkeys, or even owners that might have to give an intravenous injection, is the fact that the cutaneous coli muscle is much thicker along the jugular vein of the donkey. And that goes back to the fact that a lot of donkeys, they're territorial, and we'll talk about this, versus forming harems in a social structure. And they will fight for their territory, and one of the first places they go is right under the neck. So that's an important kind of evolutionary adaptation as well, is the fact that that muscle covering the jugular vein is much thicker. But medically, when trying to treat them or draw a blood sample, that does increase the difficulty of getting that sample unless you've had some practice. Other things in terms of their conformation, they're pointier across their top lines, their backs are longer along with their loins. A lot of times they do not possess withers, or the withers are not as sharp, should I say, compared to a horse. So that makes it a little more challenging if you decide you want to ride or pack your burro, your donkey, in terms of saddle fit. We generally think that donkeys, burros live a lot longer than horses, and that might actually go back to the fact that when we go to age donkeys, their teeth are in a more triangular versus round, oval shape, which makes aging a little more challenging in donkeys, which could aid to the fact that somebody thinks a donkey is older than maybe it actually is. The angle of the airway is different in a donkey, which leads to why donkeys bray and why they do not neigh or whinny. The other interesting thing about the angle of their trachea and their airway is the fact if you have a donkey that is maybe colicking, has abdominal upset, and you need to pass a nasal gastric tube, the increase in that angle possesses some difficulty in passing that tube, and then also we want to use a smaller diameter tool. So just a few interesting fun facts about some of the anatomical differences when we're talking about donkeys compared to horses and mules. In terms of looking at their overall health condition, I think it's really important to consider using the 1 to 5 scale versus 1 to 9, which was originally developed for thoroughbred broodmares. The 1 to 5 scale was developed by some real donkey experts that spent a lot of time in West Africa evaluating the live weight of donkeys and trying to estimate their overall health status. So I think the 1 to 5 works quite well, and ideally we'd like to see our donkeys at a 3. Anytime you see donkeys coming off the range from the videos you can find on YouTube, the few visits I've made to BLM holding facilities, you generally find these animals in really good condition. I'm sure there's always exceptions to that, and that depends on the time of year as well. But we'll talk a little more about donkeys' ability to survive on much poorer quality forages and why they're such an ideal animal for the desert-type environment. So I mentioned earlier about donkey breeds, and to some people they find that quite fascinating that there's actual breeds of donkeys. And there's 189 that are actually listed on the Domestic Animal Diversity System, which is part of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And I've provided a link for you that's a fantastic link that has photos of these different breeds and then a description of the breed. And when you look at the burros that are coming off the range, I always find it really fun to go and look at these animals and try to figure out what their lineage is, what is the donkey that contributed to this donkey that now is living, and we're getting off the range in Nevada or California or Arizona. And a lot of times you can see the differences in their phenotype and their physical makeup. The other thing I think is really important, and I'm just returning from Asia, actually from Nepal, where you can find some of these wild asses, but there's still 3 remaining wild asses, which are their own specific species that are found today. And then one of those groups you can actually break down into 6 more species. And we'll talk a little more about the differences in the wild asses and which may be related to our burros and donkeys here in the U.S. And then, last but not least, in terms of terminology, is it correct to say feral? Is it correct to say free roaming or wild? I'll leave that up to you. And again, I like to stay away from terms that I think discounts the credibility of an animal like feral. It seems like that's more of an animal you want to just remove and exterminate. So I really love the term that Return to Freedom uses as the free roaming donkeys, because anybody that truly knows a donkey and the amazing soul that a donkey has, they are kind of a free spirit. So I really like using that term, free roaming. And I think wild should be reserved for the true wild species of asses that are still out there. So let's talk a little bit about wild donkeys and maybe origins of where the donkeys we see today that are being collected off various public lands, where they first came from. I think it's important to mention on the second voyage of Christopher Columbus, that was when he decided to bring donkeys. And there were donkeys that have been found throughout the history in the U.S., but the really big impact of when a lot of donkeys were being exported and started to make a mark in the U.S.'s history was with our first president, George Washington. And again, for those of y'all who are real burro and donkey enthusiasts, you've probably heard the story of King Spain providing George Washington with 2 jacks as a gift to help start to develop the United States in terms of mule production so they could develop the country. So the first one was an Andalusian donkey, which is a breed of donkey we'll briefly talk about later on. And then the other one was a Maltese jack from the Isle of Malta. And there's some interesting stories that go along with those donkeys. So where did the wild donkeys or free-roaming donkeys or burros come from? And, there's lots of conversation about that as well, that they were part of the gold mine industry or packing industry, and people just turned them loose and various things like that. But I think it's important to think that a lot of those donkeys might have been part of farming systems. They might have been part of a mule production program, and, that program went by the wayside. Or they could also be animals that are migrating north from Central and South America, because again, they're free spirits, so they're going to be free roaming. And I think we can't forget the fact that the loss of habitat, and maybe that's why we see more of these animals. And a lot of the descendants today, like I said, I think are from some of these previous industries. So again, domestication, we know, goes back to 5,000 years ago. There's actually been remains that have been found in various Egyptian pharaoh and king's tombs. There's a wonderful article that I've linked to right there. And it tells us a lot about the domestication of the donkey in terms of the skeletal structure of the animals found in these tombs, and how that skeletal structure related to them being pack animals or being driven. And they can actually tell that from the compression of the bones that were found in these tombs. And that's a nice article that goes into more depth about that. In terms of wild donkeys, so originally we had 2 versions of wild donkeys in Africa. You had the Somalian ass, which is in East Africa, close to Somalia, which is above Kenya, next door to Ethiopia. And then on the west side of Africa, in the western countries, you had the Nubian wild ass, which unfortunately today is extinct. There are no longer any Nubian wild asses. And then there's also wild asses in Asia, the Kayag and the onager. However, it's believed that it's the Somalian wild ass and possibly the Nubian that moved from West Africa to East Africa that were the actual wild species that were domesticated to the domestic donkey that we know today. The Kayag and the onager, there's claims that they have never been domesticated due to a very aggressive and territorial nature. And unfortunately, these animals, like the Somalian wild ass, are critically endangered due to limited water supply and, again, in very war-stricken areas. So things that are really out of our control but greatly affect the wildlife and the animals that live in those areas. So going over the different breeds, in the U.S. we've pretty much lumped all of the various breeds of donkeys together and categorized them according to size and not truly according to genetics or the physical makeup or the appearance of these donkeys. The mammoth donkeys is what everybody talks about, raves about, and those are the bigger donkeys. It's a breed based upon height. And there's a lot of resemblance of the actual breeds from Europe in these animals. Unfortunately, they're wonderful donkeys, but they've been selected based upon size and height, and oftentimes we find a lot of leg deformities and complications that decreases the longevity of this animal because they've only been selected based on size and not other qualities. Then in the middle, we have the standard donkeys, and you have a small standard and you have a large standard. This is where a lot of our free-roaming burro population would fall into. And again, we could probably go back and do genetic testing and figure out what breeds of donkeys they actually originated from. But in my opinion, these donkeys are a smaller size due to the fact of the environment in which they originally came from, which promoted an animal that could only grow to a certain size and not past that because the type of forage and energy would not support that. Again, very useful donkeys, but oftentimes not as valued as the mammoth because depending on if it's a small or large standard, it might not be able to ride the animal, which has become very popular amongst a lot of the donkey enthusiasts in the U.S. today. And then last but not least, the miniature donkeys. They've gone through various ups and downs in terms of prices and demand, but absolutely adorable small donkeys, and they're considered to be 36 inches and under. I just returned from Nepal, and I was visiting a donkey sanctuary there, and they actually had miniature donkeys that were imported from India, which is right next door, and that's where all the equids come from, that were being used in brick kilns, and they are what we would consider a miniature donkey. And it was just kind of heartbreaking to see such a small animal being worked so hard. Other actual pure breeds of donkeys exist. As I referred to that publication earlier, there's 189 actual breeds of donkeys, and many of those are endangered due to the fact they're owned by an aging population of farmers. And some of those, just to go over them, is the Bois Poitou, which has received a lot of press time, was even on the cover of the Smithsonian a few years ago. They're known for their long, shaggy hair, really sweet, amazing donkeys. They're quite tall donkeys. They believe some of the heritage of the mammoth donkeys goes back to the Bois Poitou. But actually, there's two other breeds of donkeys that helped save the Bois Poitou, the Zamora, which is from the northwestern region of Spain, and the Zamora region, the Zamora Leon, which is also the size of a mammoth donkey and possesses a very long hair. And then right across the border in Portugal, in that northeastern corner of Portugal, there's the Mirandese donkey that comes from the town of Miranda de Douro. Again, a taller donkey, larger bone circumference, and longer hair. Then if you travel to Italy, you'll find many breeds that are used in the dairy industry, such as the Martena Franca, which would be considered like a Jersey cow in terms of higher butter fat content, or the Ragazzana donkey, which again, they're both at that mammoth donkey height, but much more refined. And the Ragazzana would be similar to a Holstein in terms of the amount of milk that it produces. And then you can go to South America and find, again, breeds of donkeys such as the Pasofino donkey in Colombia, the Pega donkey in Brazil, to just name a few. Two of probably the most common breeds that people refer to are the Andalusian and the Catalonian, again, Spanish breeds of donkeys. And one of the donkeys that was given to George Washington was an Andalusian. So I think if you see this roan gray to reddish tint, it might be safe to say that some of the burros that are being collected off the range might trace back to the Andalusian. The Catalonian has much more refined features about the face and the legs compared to the Ragasana donkey, but both are very similar. So I think you would truly have to do genetic testing to see which breed some of the burros actually go back to. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the different wild asses that are still barely with us today, and one being the onager, which is in Asia. Very similar characteristics to the donkey, but it is considered another species, even though it is a wild ass. So it does not get the species name of asinus like our burros and donkeys do. And they're found in Asia, northeastern India, the Gobi Desert, very endangered. And then the kayag, or the Tibetan wild ass, is found in Nepal, can also be found in Mongolia. Very aggressive in terms of their territory and monitoring their territorial area. They have experienced a lot of pressure in terms of loss of habitat and water, and that's just how people have moved, and they've turned more of the land into farming land or into production. There's also a lot of salt mining that goes on where the Tibetan wild ass is, as well as the onager that we saw earlier. So lots of habitat, lots of water. There have been some wars in these areas, but not compared to what we've seen that's affected the Somalian wild ass. But again, wild ass species that are critically or are highly threatened, that can aid to the genetic population, and probably facing a lot of the challenges our burros here today are facing. Last but not least, the Somalian wild ass, which is in East Africa, and again, in war-stricken areas, limited water supply, highly endangered. There are small populations in various zoos that are trying to preserve this breed, but again, they're very hard to keep in captivity in terms of breeding, management. They face a lot of obesity problems that leads to laminitis. And there's been some research done with the Somalian wild asses in terms of trying to put GPS collars on them and track their movement and learn more about their genetics and where they evolved from by taking DNA samples out of their manure. So just kind of interesting there. And again, it's the Somalian wild ass and the Nubian wild ass, which is now extinct from West Africa, that we believe are the origins of the domesticated donkey that we know today, and not the Asian wild ass groups that I spoke about earlier. So since we're dealing with donkeys coming from the true environment where they originally came from, a very desert, dry climate, I think it's important to think about that when you're keeping burros or you're keeping donkeys, that they are a desert creature. And animals coming from the desert have many adaptive traits that we don't see in our horses, which come from a more plains grassy type environment. So just a few examples. So it's generally hot in the desert, so you need to release heat. So that's one of the reasons for the long ears. They help dissipate heat. The shape of a donkey's nostril is more curved and different than that of a horse. That allows for airflow. That also allows for dissipating heat. The shape of the eyes are somewhat different. They're bigger eyes with a difference in the tear ducts, and that helps in terms of sandstorms. But if you need to flush the tear ducts, then it takes a practitioner that's more savvy about the location of that tear duct, which is actually in the upper 1/3 of the nostril. The baseline temperature of a donkey is much lower than that of a horse. It's at 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit compared to horses, which are around 100 degrees to 100.5. Again, it's a diurnal, has a diurnal effect, so it can be really low in the morning, reach over 100, 101 at the middle of the day, and then it will fluctuate and come back down in the evening. So the temperatures are fluctuating according to the environment. But again, it's a much lower baseline temperature, which I think is important, and again, an adaptive trait to a desert animal. Again, two things that are very unusual and unique to donkeys, and this is similar to what you would find in small ruminants like goats or sheep, is their ability to recycle urea when there's not a lot of forage available. So they can recycle the urea and actually get nitrogen and energy from that, as well as water consumption. So those are really important features for donkeys living in a desert environment, the fact they don't have to drink daily, and they will continue to consume forages even if they don't have the opportunity to drink. And when a donkey does go to drink, they drink a lot larger amount of water at once compared to a horse that will drink small sips. They'll drink several large gulps. It's also important to mention that a lot of the obesity problems that we see with donkeys or burros after they've been brought in off the range, or people that are keeping donkeys, is the fact that they are prone to what we call the thrifty gene factor. So an animal living in a desert-type environment might go through a wet season and a dry season, which would set the animal up for fasting and a famine situation. And that's another reason why we see a higher amount of triglycerides circulating in the natural bloodstream of a donkey, is their ability to break down fat and to also store their energy as a fat source. So when they're in this famine situation in the desert, they can break down the fat and they have a source of energy. To me, this is similar to a camel being able to store water in their hump and then later use that as a resource, which is another desert creature. Donkeys are browsers, not grazers, so I'm sure that brings up some interesting conversations when we talk about the environment and grazing and the actual capacity that land can have in terms of how many equine, per acre, because donkeys don't eat the same thing that horses do or the same things that cattle or sheep eat. So that's something that to be considered and to study more. They're also known for being able to consume poor quality forages. Again, that would be very common to the desert. They'd be high in fiber, they'd be low in energy, and they can take these high fiber diets and they will sit in their gastrointestinal time for a longer time compared to a horse, and they can get more out of what they're consuming. And again, this is why donkeys can live in a lot of the developing countries that we see them surviving in, working very hard and then receiving very poor nutrition because of where they evolved and where donkeys can still live today. There's also been a small amount of research that's looked at the microbiome, or the different microorganisms that live actually in the cecum, the hind gut of the donkey, and it's believed that the hind gut fermenters, or this microbiome, might be actually special to the donkey, that is geared towards digesting the high fiber type diets and getting more out of them. So just some interesting fun facts there about why they live and can survive in such harsh environments. Last but not least, there's been some very interesting research that's come out of Arizona State in the past few years by Eric Lungden for his Master's of Science in Ecology. He's now moved on to Australia to do a PhD. And I really encourage you to go to that link, and you'll see donkeys actually digging for wells in river bottoms, and they will dig down, find the water level, they'll drink out of it, and it's proved to be very important for the rest of the wildlife in that area, and then they come in and they drink the water as well. So very resourceful animals that might actually have some benefits to the ecology as a whole, but again, we need more studies that look at the benefits of donkeys. Just a few bits on feeding behavior of donkeys, and I've already mentioned a little of this in the previous slide, just referring to how they can consume high-fiber diets, very similar to their abilities to digest these high-fiber forages. They've been compared to small ruminants like goats in terms of their efficiency. And again, the fact they're browsers and they're not grazers. The other one is it's not uncommon for donkeys to consume plants high in tannins, and tannins give a very bitter taste to most livestock, so they generally would not graze on that type of plant. But donkeys actually are attracted to that, as well as you've seen they've attracted to things like thistles. So again, different grazing behavior compared to that of other livestock and even horses. We already spoke a little bit about their gastrointestinal time is shorter, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. as well as their ability to dissipate heat in these harsh desert-type environments. Again, I think it's really important to think about grazing versus browsing. Grazing is where a horse will just eat everything in front of them. They eat this grass, and they just continue, and they don't seek a certain type of grass out, where the donkey is what we call a browser. And if he is consuming grass, and he's going to consume one type of grass and then maybe go look for a broadleaf grass, or he's going to go and he's going to look for a coarser type grass, such as the donkey in this picture eating the palm leaves. And then donkeys also have a wonderful way of communicating with one another, and 5 different types of vocalization has been defined in donkeys, from grunts, growls, snorts, waffles, and of course the bray. And again, I believe those different ways of communication go back to, again, the anatomy of the donkey and the angle of the trachea, and even their nostrils are in a different form than horses, which allows them to make these unique sounds and ability to communicate with one another in 5 forms instead of maybe just a neigh and a whinny that we find in horses. Again, there's a link there to YouTube videos where you can hear some of these different examples of vocal communication in our long-eared friends. In terms of social behavior, donkeys really like to pair up and bond. So if you are considering adopting a donkey or purchasing donkeys, I highly recommend purchasing them in pairs. The only time that can be somewhat of a challenge or detrimental to the health of the donkey is if one of the donkeys passes away, because donkeys, similar to elephants, will truly mourn the death and be very mopey when that mate or that friend has passed. And the problem with that is then the donkey may not continue to consume its feed. It may get really stressed, and that sets them up for a condition called hyperlipemia. And that goes back to the donkey's ability to mobilize the fat because he stopped eating. But if he does this too quickly, then the fat will actually shut his liver down. So this is something that can be detrimental, is the social behavior of the donkey, and if he does lose its mate, because they do become very attached to one another. And we consider donkeys generally will bond for life. I spoke a little bit earlier about this, and again, people that know donkeys know that they have an area, a territory that they monitor. And so when you see the free-roaming burros, you won't see a whole harem like you would with a horse. You'd see groups of jennies with foals, and then the jacks normally are on their own, and they monitor an area. And they will monitor that area, and they will mark that area by urinating and defecating in certain areas. And again, if 2 jacks do encounter one another and they're not bonded for life, which is normally not the case, they can be very vicious in terms of fighting. And again, we spoke about the cutaneous coli muscle being much thicker over the jugular vein right there at the throat. And that's because that's where the jacks would go to fight one another. It would be under the throat, and then they would bite at the knees of one another. So they can be quite aggressive and vicious if they get to the point of fighting. Another big donkey and mule trait, which may be confused with an animal with abdominal upset or colic, is rolling. Donkeys love to roll. Again, it's one of the first things they'll oftentimes do when they're introduced to a new area or space, or if they've been out driving or you've been out working with your donkey or burro. They go right in, they drop to their knees, and they love to roll. Part of this might be to help keep insects off them, like zebras roll in the savannas of Africa. And then also it could have the territorial reference as well as just a feel-good point. So in horses, we can look at groups of free-roaming horses, and you can actually measure rank, or you can even do the same in captive horses in a paddock or a pasture setting in terms of hierarchies. We've not really seen this in terms of donkeys, how rank is measured. And so I think that's something maybe that needs to be researched more. You know, is there a rank in terms of age? Don't really see an alpha jenny like you'd see an alpha mare. So I think that's kind of interesting that we don't see this hierarchy that you would see with horses. If you do mix donkeys with horses, or you mix donkeys with horses and mules, the donkeys will be on the lower end of that hierarchy and will generally stick to themselves because they really don't want any trouble. So last but not least, I'd like to talk a little bit about reproductive behavior. And again, this goes back to adaptive qualities of donkeys. So for horses, it takes generally around 11 months to have a foal. With our donkeys, it takes an extra month, 12 months. And there's some differences if they're carrying hybrids. And that length can be affected, again, to the species of the foal as well as nutrition and the sex of the foal. But I truly believe the extra month with the donkeys is probably related to the fact they're on a poorer quality forage and they evolved from this desert compared to the plains environment. And it's also not uncommon to see donkeys actually in estrus, meaning they would be receptive to being bred, throughout the year, where horses generally start to shut down in November and then are not reproductively active again until the end of February, but generally more in March, where you'll actually see the donkeys cycling or in estrus throughout the winter months. Again, this is likely a breed difference where a lot of these donkeys originally came from Mediterranean areas where there's still sunlight a lot longer and there's still availability of forages and nutrition. So just a few of the challenges I see personally for donkeys, burros, and even our wild asses. Loss of habitat is definitely a problem. It's a global problem they're facing. And then the donkeys that we are keeping in a domesticated type situation, our biggest problem is obesity if these animals are not in working environments. There's also a big decrease in genetic diversity. And even the breeds that are out there, those 189 breeds, there's very small populations of those breeds. And the same is true from what I've read about the different burro populations. They're very limited, and you can face all sorts of problems in terms of inbreeding when you limit the genetics. A lot of donkeys are owned by an aging population, and this is especially true for some of these endangered breeds that are found throughout Europe. So what will happen when these people grow old and they go on? Who will continue this donkey tradition? The pressure of the meat and skin industry for donkeys is really honestly terrifying to me because it has put a huge pressure on the exportation of live donkeys as well as donkey carcasses and skins from developing countries like Africa. Even in China, where this demand is so strong, the number of donkeys over the past several years has decreased by 3 to 4 million. There are farming programs in place in China to keep the population so they can feed this industry, but they're still more or less preying on these developing countries, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't start to go after free-roaming donkey herds as well in areas where they can access them. Because of this industry, there's been a huge increase in stolen donkeys as well as the demand for donkeys in a different sense. There has been some reports of fertility control working in donkeys, especially in some of the Caribbean islands. Some of the vet schools like Ross University has looked at using PZP, but they have found they've got a 100% abscess rate. So, maybe that's not the best for the donkey's welfare, and maybe that's not the answer. So that is another challenge that they're facing where they are trying to use fertility control methods in roaming populations of donkeys. So a few ways we here at UC Davis have tried to meet these challenges. Next year we'll be hosting the 6th Annual Donkey Welfare Symposium to discuss such topics, such as, fertility control programs in donkeys. Are they just as effective as in wild horses? And how to face endangered breeds of donkeys. And we spoke a lot this year about the emerging skin trade industry and the impact that's having on donkeys on a global basis. Some other things we've done, we have an annual burro adoption, and they are Bureau of Land Management donkeys that we've been working with the BLM on. And we brought in 16 donkeys this year, and veterinary students were involved in a donkey burro training program and worked with these donkeys, and some are still working with these donkeys. And then they were adopted out at the end of the Donkey Welfare Symposium. This does two things. One, it helps the vet students learn more about equine behavior, and especially donkey behavior, an opportunity that they likely would not receive in vet school. So it gives them that experience. And then number two, it makes these animals more adoptable and suitable to adopters, because many times people that have come to adopt these animals have never owned an equine before, but are very interested in adopting a donkey. And now they have an animal that they can put a halter on, they can lead, they can pick its feet up. And again, some of the trainers have been more successful with the donkeys than others. It just depends on, the personality of the donkey as well as its previous animal-human interaction. So that's a few ways we're trying to address the program. I've listed the website for the Donkey Welfare Symposium. I do not have the dates for next year. Traditionally, it's been held the first weekend in November. And we would love for all of you to come out and adopt a donkey, learn more about donkeys and burros and these emerging issues. Again, there's other institutions looking at fertility control for populations, especially on the island, such as Ross University. The Donkey Sanctuary from the United Kingdom is very interested now in focusing some of their monitoring efforts in free-roaming donkeys. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, some of that comes from the pressures of the donkeys for the skin and meat trade. And I believe there's been a renewed interest in donkeys. Each year the symposium seems to get bigger. There's more interest in using donkeys for day trips up in the mountains as a pack animal, doing pack racing, companionship, showing, as well as using donkeys to guard their livestock like sheep and goats. So with that, I greatly appreciate your attention, and just a few images from the students working with their burros, which I tell all the burros when they get to our farm at UC Davis, I was like, okay, you're a burro when you arrive, but you're now graduating to be a donkey. And like I said, I like changing that term around because I think that makes them more appealing to the adopters. But these donkeys really did well, and I was really proud of the students because they really connected with these animals, and we've got a whole new generation of people now appreciating donkeys. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to me. There's my email, and I'll entertain any questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLean. We have switched to the Q&A mode. It looks like we have a couple here for you, Amy, and we'll go first with Dusty.
Okay.
Okay, so I got a written question from him. So the question is, how long do donkeys typically live?
Yeah, I see that. So actually, The Horse magazine recently did an interview with myself and one of the veterinarians at the Donkey Sanctuary in the UK. And that was one of the topics we spoke about. We generally think they live longer than horses, to the mid-30s to 40s. Personally, I think they do live a long time, 25 to 30 years easily. I think sometimes we overestimate how long they live because of the shape of their teeth. So 25 to 30 at least.
Okay, and then we had, I don't have a name, but somebody from area code 303?
Yes, yeah. Charlotte is my name, and I'm active with the Long Hopes Donkey Shelter in Colorado. And my question is this, what are the obstacles to doing more research on either wild asses or donkeys or the free-roaming donkeys that we have in the U.S.? Because I know that the livestock industry sponsors a lot of the research that's done on other ungulates, other hoofed animals, for example, but not, and certainly the hunting industry. But the donkeys don't really have a constituency like that. So what are the obstacles you see, and how can they be overcome to get more research on donkeys?
That's a great question. Usually the biggest obstacle in doing research with donkeys, and I started doing research with donkeys for my PhD in 2006, and the biggest obstacle is funding. And donkeys, unfortunately, is not what we'd per se is a sexy topic. And it's a symbol of poverty and or maybe even a nuisance in this sense. So trying to convince people to fund research is usually a big challenge to overcome. I've been very successful in traveling to 23 different countries with very, very shoestring budgets and getting as much information and research done on donkeys, and here recently more so in the area of mules. I have, in the past just few weeks, me and some of the veterinarians here at UC Davis are interested in doing some studies with the free roaming population because it's such an untapped resource, and there's so much we can learn from these animals, from just some of the health perspectives I spoke about in terms of microbiome, what type of diseases they are not bringing in that can tell us more about how resistant and hardy these animals are. And then the other challenge is having students and researchers that are dedicated to donkeys, and that's very, very few out there that have an interest in learning more about these animals or protecting donkeys.
Do we have any other questions? Check. I don't think we. Oh, we do have a question, a written question here. I don't know if you can see that one from.
Oh yeah, PZP. Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know if everyone can see the online question, but about my thoughts on using PZP on wild burros, aside from the abscesses. The abscesses were pretty alarming. I know there's a 14-gauge needle that's utilized for that injection, but my neighbor is actually an expert in PZP and has done a lot of research in that area, and I spoke to him about that, and he had some ideas on where the injection could be given that would maybe decrease the number of abscesses they're seeing at Ross University. But, I think that's a great way of controlling the wild populations. I would be interested in how it affects the social behavior. But if it means the animals can stay in an area, they can stay on that land versus having to be gathered and, going that route, I think it's a viable option. There's only one paper, to my knowledge, that has been published on using PZP in wild burros or free-roaming burros. And then the veterinarian from Ross who attended the Donkey Welfare Symposium this year, Dr. Peterson, Eric Peterson, he has recently published 2 more papers on using PZP, and it was effective in terms of preventing the estrus cycle for 2 years in those donkeys, similar to what they've seen in the mare horses.
Okay, well, if we don't have any other more questions, I'm going to wrap up in just a moment. I wanted to thank everybody. Thank you, Dr. McLean, in particular, for taking the time, especially, ladies and gentlemen, she just came back from Nepal Monday morning after a 30-hour flight. We really appreciate her taking the time to talk to us about burros today. There's an opportunity here if you've not spent a lot of time around burros, both at our sanctuary in Lompoc. For those of you who are in California, we also have a satellite sanctuary in San Luis Obispo, and there are burros in both places. And last but not least, this holiday, everybody needs a burro in their pocket, so you can give the gift of choice to your loved one by letting them choose a horse or burro sponsorship, sanctuary churros, photo safaris, merchandise, or other. You can make a donation to Return to Freedom with a gift card, and you can find out more about those gift cards at returntofreedom.org/gift card. Thank you, everybody. We'll be sending you links to the webinar so you can, if you want to watch parts of it again, You also have Dr. McLean's email address if you'd like to send her a question that comes to you after it's offline. We'll also have the slides for you so that you can check out those links of donkeys digging wells and other great things. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.